Hey everyone, 99% of you watching aren't subscribed. Let's change that. Hit that subscribe button, and at 1,000 subscribers, we'll drop special stories just for you.
For 1,000 cycles, the Carthage dominion ruled unchallenged. They did not build empires. Empires implied resistance, wars, borders, diplomacy, failure. The Carthages had no concept of such inefficiencies. Their existence was simpler, older, and far more absolute. They fed. Entire star systems were nothing more than feeding grounds, cataloged and forgotten once consumed. Worlds rich in life were marked, observed briefly, then stripped down to sterile husks drifting in silence around dying suns. To the Carthages, life was not sacred, nor rare. It was fuel, and fuel was meant to be used. Their ships, if such a crude term could even apply, were not constructed. They were grown, massive, organic titans drifted through the void, their surfaces rippling with slow, deliberate motion, like the skin of some slumbering beast. Veins of bioluminescent energy pulsed across their hulls, carrying nutrients and signals through living tissue that spanned kilometers. Within them, consciousness flowed, not individual, but shared. The Dominion was one mind, a vast, distributed intelligence that stretched across light years, every vessel neuron, every tendril of thought. Decisions were not debated. They simply emerged, the inevitable conclusion of perfect biological consensus. And that consensus had never been wrong. Not once. The galaxy had tried to resist. There had been others before, species that reached the stars, that built machines and weapons and fragile alliances in a hope of survival. Some had even detected the Carthages before the harvest began. It made no difference. The Dominion did not rush. It observed. It learned just enough. Then it adapted. On the world-designated Harvest Site 1842, a civilization had developed atmospheric shields capable of repelling early-stage microbial consumption. Within 2 rotations, the Carthages altered their approach, deploying subterranean infiltration organisms that bypassed the shield entirely. The planet fell within days. On Harvest Site 3901, orbital defense platforms had successfully destroyed 3 Carthage vessels, an unprecedented loss. The Dominion responded by evolving decoy organisms that mimicked their own ships, overwhelming targeting systems, and exposing the defense grid's firing patterns. The platforms were neutralized. The biosphere followed. Every attempt at resistance only refined the predator. Every failure fed its evolution. Eventually, resistance stopped, not because civilizations gave up, because none remained long enough to try again. Detection of a viable world was routine. The Dominion sensory reach extended across vast distances, scanning for chemical signatures, oxygen-rich atmospheres, liquid water, complex carbon chains. When such a world was found, it was cataloged, analyzed, and assigned a designation. This time was no different. The signal emerged faintly at first, buried within the background noise of a distant spiral arm. But as the Dominion focused its perception, the data clarified. A star, stable, yellow, 3rd orbital body. Atmosphere, nitrogen-oxygen dominant. Hydrosphere, extensive. Biosignature, dense. Highly diverse. The collective awareness sharpened. This was not merely viable. It was abundant. The designation formed instantly across the network. Harvest Site 7213. Observation began. Unlike lesser predators, the Carthages did not attack blindly. Information was efficiency. Efficiency was survival. Probes, microscopic and undetectable, were dispatched ahead of the main fleet, drifting silently into the system. They embedded themselves within asteroid fields, within the magnetosphere, even within the upper layers of the atmosphere. They watched. What they found was curious. The dominant species, self-identified as humans, were technologically active but fragmented. Thousands of independent communication networks, competing governments, military forces divided by arbitrary territorial boundaries, no unified command structure, no planetary defense grid, no coordinated response protocols. From a purely strategic standpoint, the analysis was immediate. Low threat, high yield. The Dominion had consumed more advanced civilizations with less favorable conditions. And yet, there was noise, not literal noise. though the electromagnetic spectrum around the planet was saturated with signals, but something less tangible, patterns that did not align with known prey behaviors. The humans were constantly transmitting, not just internally, but outward into space itself. Structured signals, layered with mathematical frameworks, repeated across frequencies. The Carthics processed the data. It was not a distress call, nor was it a warning. It was information, an offering, perhaps, or a declaration. The distinction was irrelevant. All prey made noise before the end. The fleet arrived without announcement. From the darkness between stars, the first of the Carthics vessels emerged, vast silhouettes blotting out distant constellations. Then more followed, dozens and hundreds, until the void itself seemed to pulse with slow, living motion. They did not accelerate. They did not need to. Gravity wells bent subtly around them, their organic mass interacting with space-time in ways no mechanical construct could replicate. They drifted into the outer edges of the system, like a tide that could not be stopped. Planets were ignored. Gas giants, asteroid belts, barren rocks. None held value. Only one world mattered. Earth. Human detection came quickly. Their instruments were crude, but numerous. Telescopes, satellites, deep space monitoring arrays, all turned toward the incoming anomaly. At first, confusion, then disbelief, then realization. Across the planet, systems activated, governments convened, militaries mobilized. But beneath the surface of that activity, something else unfolded, something the Carthics did not fully comprehend. Order, not centralized, not uniform, but present. Data moved rapidly across networks. Information was shared, analyzed, redistributed. The fragmented species began, in its own chaotic way, to align. The Dominion observed. Still, the conclusion did not change. Outcome, certain. The first harvesting phase began at the edge of Earth's atmosphere. Carthics vessels unfurled. From their living hulls extended vast tendrils, delicate, almost graceful structures that spread outward like the branches of some cosmic organism. At their tips, microscopic spores were released, invisible clouds drifting downward toward the planet below. These were the beginning. Consumption at the smallest scale. The spores would settle into ecosystems, infiltrate cellular structures, and begin the process of conversion, breaking down organic matter into usable energy, replicating as they spread. Forests would wither, oceans would cloud, life would dissolve. It had always worked. It would work again. Below, humanity watched the sky. Some saw only distant shapes, barely visible against the stars. Others saw everything. Some saw only distant shapes, barely visible against the stars. Others saw everything. And somewhere, deep within their networks, decisions were already being made. Not of surrender, not of panic, but of response. For the first time in its long existence, the Carthics Dominion initiated a harvest without fully understanding its prey. It did not consider this a risk. It had never needed to. The spores descended. The atmosphere embraced them, and the silent apex predator prepared to feed, unaware that this world had been shaped by predators long before it ever arrived. The first signs of failure were microscopic. Within seconds of atmospheric entry, the Carthic spores dispersed exactly as intended, billions of engineered organisms spreading through jet streams, riding thermal currents, sinking into clouds and drifting toward land and sea. Their purpose was simple: infiltrate, convert, replicate. On 100 worlds before, this moment had marked the beginning of the end. On Earth, it marked the beginning of something else. At first, the data appeared normal. Spore adhesion, successful. Cellular penetration, successful. Initial replication, within expected parameters. Then divergence. Replication rates fluctuated. Metabolic efficiency dropped. Signal cohesion, normally seamless across the distributed spore network, began to fragment. The Carthics Dominion registered the anomaly but did not yet interpret it as a threat. Environmental variation was expected. Each biosphere presented minor resistance before collapse. Adaptation routines initiated automatically. The spores adjusted enzyme outputs, altered their molecular binding structures, optimized for local chemistry. For a moment, stability returned. Then the collapse began. Across Earth's surface, Ecosystems reacted, not passively, not uniformly, but violently. In the upper atmosphere, airborne microorganisms, bacteria, fungal spores, viral particles, interacted with the invading Carthix organisms in unpredictable ways. Some were consumed as expected, others were not. They adapted. Horizontal gene transfer, primitive by Carthix standards but alarmingly fast, began altering native microbes in real time. They incorporated fragments of alien biology, rewriting themselves into something new, something hostile. The Carthix spores, designed to dominate stable systems, found themselves in a battlefield of constant mutation. Their own adaptations became liabilities within minutes, countered by a biosphere that did not follow predictable evolutionary timelines. Oceans turned against them next. Marine ecosystems, dense with microbial life, became zones of resistance. Plankton populations shifted. Bacterial blooms surged, releasing biochemical compounds that disrupted spore cohesion. Entire currents carried corrupted Carthix matter into regions where it could no longer function. Forests followed. Fungal networks beneath the soil, vast, interconnected systems older than human civilization, responded as if recognizing an intrusion. They rerouted nutrients, altered chemical outputs, and effectively quarantined infected zones. The planet was not defending itself consciously, but it was defending itself effectively. The Dominion recalculated. This was no longer routine resistance. This was systemic incompatibility. New spores were deployed, more aggressive, more invasive. They targeted deeper cellular structures, bypassing initial defenses and attempting rapid conversion before countermeasures could form. For several minutes, success returned. Vegetation in isolated regions began to decay. Small ecosystems collapsed. Data streams indicated localized victories. Then humanity intervened. The first human response did not involve weapons. It involved information. Global networks, previously fragmented, shifted into overdrive. Research institutions, military agencies, independent scientists, even civilian systems began sharing data at unprecedented speed. The strange atmospheric particles were identified within hours. Their biological structure was mapped within days. And within that mapping, patterns emerged. The Carthix spores were adaptive, but they followed rules, predictable rules. Humans had spent millennia studying pathogens, bacteria, viruses, parasites. They had learned to model behavior, to anticipate mutation, to exploit weaknesses. Now, they applied that knowledge. Countermeasures were not deployed globally. They were deployed strategically. In key regions, engineered microorganisms were released, designed not to destroy the Carthix spores directly, but to destabilize their adaptive processes. They interfered with replication signals, introduced false feedback loops, and accelerated mutation beyond functional limits. The result was catastrophic for the invaders. Entire spore networks collapsed into inert biomass. Others mutated into non-viable forms, unable to sustain themselves. And some, most disturbingly, began attacking each other. The Dominion felt it, not as pain, but as loss of coherence. Across the distributed consciousness, signals became inconsistent. Feedback loops failed. Portions of the collective awareness went dark, severed as their biological components ceased to function. This had never happened at this scale. Not during initial harvest. Not against a pre-industrial species. The conclusion began to shift. Unexpected resistance. Adaptation required. The second phase initiated. If the biosphere could not be subdued from within, it would be dismantled from above. Carthix vessels in orbit repositioned. Their tendrils retracted, replaced by more aggressive structures. Feeding lances capable of penetrating deep into planetary crust and oceanic depths. Rather than rely on microbial conversion, they would extract raw biological matter directly, a less efficient method, but effective. They had used it before. This time, humanity did not wait. Detection systems had tracked the orbital movements. Predictions were made, targets identified, and for the first time, human military forces engaged. From across the planet, launch systems activated. Missiles, railgun projectiles, directed energy weapons. Thousands of independent systems converging on a single objective. The the sky lit with ascent trails. The Karthics did not evade. They had no reason to. Primitive weapons had never posed a significant threat. Impact. Explosions blossomed against living hulls. Bright, brief flashes against vast, organic surfaces. Most dissipated harmlessly, absorbed by layers of adaptive tissue. But not all. Some struck at calculated points, junctions where nutrient flow was concentrated, where neural signaling was most dense. Those were not random hits. They were targeted. The Dominion registered damage. Minor, but precise. Then came the first true deviation. A human vessel, small, metallic, inefficient, broke through the upper atmosphere and entered orbital space. It moved with erratic acceleration, far beyond what its structure should have tolerated. It was not alone. More followed. They did not engage in direct confrontation. They maneuvered, circling, probing, observing. And then they struck, not at the largest ships, not at the most obvious targets, at the connective tissue. Localized strikes severed tendrils linking harvesting structures to core vessels. Energy transfer faltered. Internal communication pathways destabilized. The Karthics adapted, redirecting signals, rerouting nutrients. But the attacks continued. Relentless, precise, learning. And then, for the first time in its recorded existence, the Karthics' Dominion experienced something it did not have a framework for. A vessel lost cohesion, not gradually, not through starvation. Instantly, its neural network collapsed, signals fragmenting into noise before ceasing entirely. The massive structure drifted, lifeless, its organic systems shutting down in cascading failure. The Dominion registered the absence, a gap in the collective, a missing thought, cause unknown. Across Earth, human networks processed the result. They had found something, not a weakness in strength, but a weakness in connection. And they were already adjusting. Above the planet, the Karthics' fleets paused, not physically, but cognitively. Their movements slowed, their actions recalculated. The certainty that defined every previous harvest began to erode. This was no longer a simple feeding. It was a problem, one that required more than adaptation. It required understanding. Below, humanity did not celebrate. They did not assume victory. They continued, analyzing, predicting, preparing, because unlike every other species a Dominion had encountered, they were not trying to survive the predator. They were trying to outthink it. And far above them, in the cold silence of orbit, the apex predator of the galaxy began, slowly, reluctantly, to realize something it had never considered before. This prey was learning just as fast as it was. And that changed everything. The shift in strategy was immediate. The Karthics' Dominion did not panic. Panic required individuality, and individuality did not exist within the Dominion. But it did something just as significant. It prioritized. The harvest was no longer the objective. Control was. Across orbit, the vast Karthics vessels repositioned with new intent. Their slow, drifting grace vanished, replaced by calculated movement. Formation patterns emerged tight, interlinked clusters designed to maximize signal cohesion and minimize vulnerability. They were no longer feeding. They were hunting. Human vessels, once ignored as background noise, became primary targets. The first counterattack was swift and devastating. From the living hulls of the Dominion ships, new structures unfolded. Long, filament-like extensions that pulsed with concentrated energy. Unlike harvesting tendrils, these were designed for precision. They struck without warning. Invisible waves rippled through space, intersecting with human ships. At first, nothing happened. Then systems failed. Navigation arrays glitched. Communication channels filled with static. In some vessels, entire control systems went dark as if something had reached inside and disconnected them. Neural disruption. The Karthics had identified dependency. Human ships relied on centralized control systems, vulnerable to targeted interference. Several vessels drifted lifelessly. Others spiraled out of formation. The Dominion adapted again, faster now, more focused. But humanity had anticipated escalation. The moment the first disruption waves were detected, countermeasures activated. Ships switched to decentralized control protocols. Manual overrides replaced automated systems. Redundant networks, once considered inefficient, became lifelines. Human vessels staggered, but they did not fall. Then came the ambush. A cluster of Karthik ships advanced toward what appeared to be a weakened human formation. Damaged vessels, erratic movement, failing signals, prey behavior. The Dominion closed in. At optimal range, the damaged ships ignited, not explosions, deployments. Dozens of smaller objects dispersed, each broadcasting biological signatures nearly identical to Earth's biosphere. False signals flooded Karthik's sensors, overwhelming their targeting systems. Decoys. At the same moment, hidden human vessels emerged from behind the cluster, engines flaring at maximum output. They did not attack the ships. They attacked the space between them. Focused electromagnetic bursts detonated in precise locations, disrupting the delicate signal network linking the Karthik's vessels together. For a fraction of a second, the Dominion's cohesion faltered, and in that fraction, human weapons struck. This time, the damage was not minor. Sections of living hull were torn away, tendrils severed, internal systems exposed. The Dominion adapted instantly, rerouting signals, reinforcing damaged structures. But the pattern was clear. The humans were not reacting anymore. They were predicting. The realization deepened as intercepted transmissions were analyzed. Human communications were chaotic on the surface. Multiple languages, conflicting tones, overlapping signals. But beneath that chaos was structure, data sharing, continuous refinement. Every encounter with the Dominion was recorded, dissected, redistributed across the entire planet and fleet network. No experience was isolated. No failure was wasted. The Karthiks began to understand. This species did not rely on instinct alone. It relied on accumulated knowledge, shared, improved, and weaponized in real time. The Dominion responded with infiltration. If external engagement was insufficient, they would attack from within. New organisms were grown, microscopic, adaptive, designed to infiltrate human technology and biology alike. They traveled within debris fields, clung to damaged vessels, slipped through microscopic breaches and holes. Once inside, they spread. Interfaces were targeted first, control systems, neural links, any point where human and machine interacted. The organisms attempted to integrate, to override, to convert. In isolated cases, they succeeded. Ships went silent. Crew members lost control of their own systems. But the success did not propagate, because humans did something the Dominion did not expect. They sacrificed. Infected vessels were isolated, cut off from networks, abandoned, or in some cases, deliberately destroyed. There was no hesitation once contamination was confirmed. The spread stopped. Containment over preservation. The Karthiks registered the pattern. This species would destroy parts of itself to survive. And then, deeper analysis revealed something far more unsettling. Human historical data, intercepted, decoded, studied, contained references to predators, not alien, native, creatures that hunted in packs, creatures that stalked silently, creatures that adapted to prey behavior over time. The Dominion processed visual records, wolves coordinating attacks, sharks circling before striking, big cats waiting in stillness for the perfect moment. And then it processed humanity itself, a species that had once been prey, physically weaker than many of its competitors, slower, less armored, less lethal in direct confrontation. Yet it had survived, not by strength, but by learning, by observing predators, and becoming something else. The next human offensive confirmed it. Instead of direct engagement, human fleets began to withdraw, slowly, deliberately. They left gaps in their formations, created apparent weaknesses, transmitted fragmented signals suggesting confusion and retreat. The Dominion followed. Of course it did. Predators pursued weakness. That was law. The trap was not immediate. It unfolded over time. Human vessels led Karthik's forces into specific orbital regions, zones saturated with prepositioned satellites, debris fields, and hidden weapons platforms. Then, at once, everything activated. Signal jammers flooded the area, disrupting Karthik's communication. Mines, previously inert, detonated in coordinated sequences, targeting movement pathways. Directed energy beams converged from multiple vectors, striking not at random, but at calculated structural vulnerabilities. The Dominion fought back, adapting, resisting, reorganizing. But the environment itself had been turned against it. This was not a battlefield. It was a hunting ground, and the Karthics were no longer the hunters. Losses accumulated, not catastrophic, but unacceptable. More vessels experienced partial disconnection, moments where the collective consciousness fragmented before reasserting control. Each instance left traces, instability, inconsistency. The Dominion was not designed for this. It had never needed to be. For the first time, a new directive emerged across the collective. Not adaptation, not aggression, but something more fundamental. Understanding required. The humans were not behaving as prey. They were not even behaving as conventional predators. They were something else. Something that combined instinct with analysis, aggression with restraint, individuality with cooperation, a contradiction, a threat below on Earth. Humanity continued its work. There were no grand speeches, no declarations of victory, only constant motion. Scientists refining models, engineers redesigning weapons, commanders adjusting strategies based on the latest data. Every second mattered, every detail counted, because they understood something the Dominion was only beginning to grasp. This was not a war of strength. It was a war of adaptation speed, and humanity had spent its entire existence preparing for exactly that. In orbit, the Karthic's Dominion tightened its formations, reinforcing connections, minimizing exposure. It was still vast, still powerful, still capable of consuming the planet below. But something had changed, not in its biology, not in its strategy, in its perception. For the first time since it begun its endless harvest across the stars, the Dominion no longer saw Earth as prey. It saw it as a rival, and rivals could not be allowed to exist. By the time the final phase began, neither side resembled what it had been at first contact. Humanity was no longer reacting. The Karthic's Dominion was no longer certain, and the battlefield had shifted beyond orbit, beyond atmosphere, into something far more fragile. Connection. The Dominion had learned to defend itself. After repeated disruptions, its fleets tightened their formations to near impenetrable density. Signal pathways were reinforced, redundancies layered upon redundancies. Where once their collective consciousness flowed effortlessly, now it pulsed through hardened channels. Protected, regulated, stable, but slower. Human analysts noticed immediately. Every reinforcement came at a cost. The Karthics had optimized for survival. Humanity optimized for exploitation. The plan that followed was not designed to destroy the Dominion. It was designed to break it, not physically. Conceptually, it began with infiltration, not through force, but through imitation. Human biotech divisions, working in coordination across continents, had spent days studying fragments of Karthic's biology, captured spores, severed tissue, remnants of destroyed vessels. They mapped neural signaling patterns, biochemical pathways, structural hierarchies. Then they did what humans always did. They copied and altered. The result was something that should not have existed. Hybrid organisms, grown in controlled environments, engineered to mimic Karthic's biological signatures closely enough to pass as part of the collective, but different enough to introduce instability. They were not weapons. They were questions. Insertion was a challenge. Direct assault on a core vessel was impossible. Too heavily defended, too interconnected. So humanity returned to what had worked before. They created weakness. A cluster of human ships staged a deliberate failure near the edge of Karthic's formation, broadcasting erratic signals, simulating catastrophic system collapse. Life sign signatures fluctuated wildly, mimicking biological distress. The Dominion observed, analyzed, concluded. Prey. Karthic's tendrils extended, moving to harvest the drifting vessels. They made contact, and in that moment, the first hybrid organisms entered the Dominion. At first, nothing changed. The infiltrators integrated seamlessly, attaching to internal pathways, embedding themselves within nutrient flows, aligning with neural signal patterns. The collective did not reject them. Why would it? They were indistinguishable. Then, slowly, they began to misalign. A single signal, slightly delayed. Another, amplified beyond expected parameters. A feedback loop that should have resolved, but didn't. The deviations were microscopic, individually meaningless. But the Karthics were not individuals. They were a system, and systems depend on precision. The disruption spread, not like a virus, like noise. Signals that should have synchronized began to drift. Nodes interpreted shared data differently. Minor inconsistencies forced constant recalibration, slowing decision-making processes. The Dominion adapted. Of course it did. It isolated affected pathways, rerouted signals, attempted to purge the anomalies. But the infiltrators had anticipated that. They adapted too. Every attempt to isolate them created new inconsistencies elsewhere. Every correction introduced further error. For the first time, the collective consciousness experienced something dangerously close to fragmentation. Not complete, not yet, but enough to matter. Human forces moved immediately. They had been waiting for this moment. From orbit and beyond, fleets advanced, not in scattered formations, but in coordinated waves. Every movement calculated to exploit the Dominion's instability. Strikes were no longer exploratory. They were decisive. Weapons targeted synchronization nodes, points where multiple Karthix vessels depended on shared signals. Electromagnetic bursts, precisely tuned, amplified the internal noise already spreading through the system. The effect compounded. What had been minor inconsistencies became cascading failures. Inside the Dominion, something unprecedented occurred. Disagreement. Not ideological. There was no individuality for that, but structural. Different segments of the collective began to process conflicting interpretations of reality. Signals contradicted each other. Actions lost alignment. Ships hesitated. Others acted prematurely. Some turned, responded to threats that no longer existed. And hesitation for a predator is fatal. Human fleets closed a distance. This time, they did not withdraw. They pressed forward. A central Karthix vessel, one of the largest, a nexus of immense neural density, became the focal point. Its destruction would not end the Dominion, but its destabilization would accelerate everything already happening. Human infiltration units deployed. Not ships, not soldiers in the traditional sense. Biotechnological constructs, part human design, part Karthix mimicry, launched toward the vessel's surface. They were not intercepted. To the Dominion, they were indistinguishable from itself. They breached. Inside, the environment was unlike anything human science had ever encountered. Living corridors pulsing with energy, vast chambers of interconnected tissue, signals flowing like currents through an organic network that spanned kilometers. And at its center, convergence, the densest point of shared consciousness. The infiltrators did not attack it directly. They interfaced, connecting to the very system that defined the Dominion. And then they did what they were designed to do. They introduced contradiction, signals that could not resolve, inputs that had no consistent interpretation, feedback loops that amplified uncertainty instead of correcting it. Across the entire Karthix Dominion, the effect was immediate. Synchronization shattered, not completely, but irreparably. Where once there had been a single, unified awareness, now there were fragments, clusters of thought no longer perfectly aligned. Ships lost coordination. Some drifted. Others fired blindly. A few, cut off entirely, became something the Dominion had never allowed before. Alone, the human offensive reached its peak. Target after target fell, not because the Karthix were weak, but because they were no longer one. Each isolated segment could still fight, but it could no longer adapt collectively. And that was the Dominion's greatest strength. One by one, the massive living ships were destroyed. Some attempted to flee, breaking formation, retreating into deep space. Human fleets did not pursue far. They didn't need to. The damage was already done. Silence returned to orbit, not the quiet of emptiness, but the absence of something that had once filled it completely. On Earth, there was no singular moment of celebration, no instant where the entire planet stopped and declared victory. Instead, confirmation came gradually. Karthix signals faded, then vanished. Remaining vessels drifted beyond detection. The sky cleared. Humanity had not eradicated the Dominion. It had done something far more significant. It had ended its dominance. Days later, a transmission was prepared. Not a weapon, not a warning. A message. It was broadcast outward, repeated across frequencies, encoded in mathematical structures any advanced intelligence could understand. Simple, direct. We survived our world by learning every predator that hunted us. You were no different. Far beyond the edges of the system, scattered remnants of the Carthics drifted in isolation, fragments of a once perfect whole. They received the transmission. They processed it, individually, for the first time, and in that fractured awareness, something emerged, not unity, not certainty, but understanding. They had believed themselves to be the galaxy's only apex predators. They had been wrong. They had simply never encountered something that hunted differently, something that learned faster, something that turned survival into strategy, something like humanity. And in the vast, dark silence between stars, the former apex predators fled, not from destruction, but from the one thing they could no longer overcome, a species that had learned how to hunt them,